Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 156 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Amanda-Lee Pitzer for this episode. And Amanda-Lee is the author of the new memoir, The Relieved Widow. So, relieved, you say? So, yeah, the title is a bit jarring, but Amanda-Lee is, I think, doing readers a real service by being open and honest about her story of losing her military husband to suicide when their boys were 8 and 10. She recalls that when her therapist friend pointed out that she seemed to feel relieved, her reaction was, "I'm not allowed to say that. No one can know that." By talking about her journey, Amanda-Lee gives us permission to talk about the things that are our own realities. She also shares practical tips for navigating the hard conversations with her boys, both right after it happened and in the years to come. And I think these are really important discussions for all widowed parents to hear. Before we jump into my discussion with Amanda-Lee, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. So first, we have Children's Grief Awareness Month coming up very soon in November. And I've got some terrific interviews lined up for you, including talking with renowned grief expert David Kessler about his new workbook. And also, I wanted to make sure you caught the last few episodes of the show. Some listeners have been asking recently for more stories and reflections from widowed parents who had complicated situations when their spouses died. So in addition to today's discussion with Amanda-Lee, we have last week's with Jeanette Konzakowski, plus the one before that with Jessica Waite. And those were both terrific discussions. Both of them have new books in which they dive deep and open up about the challenges in their marriages and how that's affected their journeys in widowhood. So that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Amanda-Lee Pitzer. Amanda-Lee is a self-proclaimed master of starting over and always believes that restoration will come, even when it arrives in a package that was unexpected. She became widowed at the age of 36 and was faced with raising her 2 boys alone. Amanda-Lee is the author of a brand new book, The Relieved Widow. She's joining us today from North Carolina. Amanda-Lee, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me today, Jenny.
Yeah, well, it's great to talk to you. And I read your book. Thank you for sharing that with me. And
Thanks.
I've been looking forward to this discussion because I think it's really important that we have these conversations with real people who've been widowed and raising kids. And in your case, real people who have complicated situations. And I mean, it's spoiler, I guess your husband died by suicide. And,
Right.
I think this is an important topic that is hard to talk about and important to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing in your book first, and then with us today, about this, because I think it's, I've heard it said that memoir is an act of service.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're providing a service by writing this and sharing,
Thank you.
with other people, who are also having losses to suicide and or other complicated situations that are not so easy to talk about, where it's really easy to feel alone.
Right. Yeah. And that's exactly, what this was born out of. I had a lot of people shove books my way, and I would, flip through it and be like, I don't feel this way. Nope, this isn't me. And, and I probably went through 4 or 5 and I was, just like, nobody gets this feeling. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, that shoving books, that reminds me, my husband had brain cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was sick, when he was first diagnosed, at first we just knew that it was a tumor. We didn't know if it was cancer. We didn't know which type of tumor, Someone sent me a book that was a memoir of somebody who had a brain tumor and survived. And it was sort of a humorous, account of having this tumor. And I think I read a few pages and I was like, nope.
Yeah.
Like this,
Not
and it
for
was,
me.
yeah. And it was because, one brain tumor isn't the same as the next, and the implications are the same as the next. And in your case, someone else's loss that might be entirely different from yours So you both lost husbands, yes, but that may be where the similarity ends, and maybe the
Hmm.
experiences are so different, um, that someone else's account of something entirely different might or might not be all that useful.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even two suicide losses can be completely different.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's definitely a unique, and like I said, I didn't see anything like that out there. And so, finally I just got to work and I was like, I'm tired of being quiet.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has actually reminded me, and we'll jump right in a second here to your story. But I just got contacted by a listener who was asking for more stories
Hmm.
like this. She's having trouble finding resources, as she called it, end of life stories that are really ugly. And I
Hmm.
don't think she meant that the death was ugly. I think that she meant that the larger context and situation and relationship before loss was really hard.
Right.
And then also he died, and she was having trouble finding things, that felt suitable for her and her family. So,
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna
And I
be,
think that's, a lot of times the messy stories we like to wrap up with a bow and try to make them look better. But I don't think that helps anybody who's been through
yeah.
something messy for sure.
Yeah, and that's if people talk about it at all, right?
Right.
I think too often it's, maybe it's too hard or too embarrassing or too stigmatized or too something that leads people to just not talk about it much, if at all.
Right. Yeah, 100%. With mine being a military loss, of course, when people find out, I think they're expecting some grandiose story. They're like, "Oh, did he die in combat?" And I'm like,
Mm.
"Well, it was actually suicide." And they're like, "Oh." And so
Right.
it's a very, unique response. And granted, everyone, I'm sure they're not expecting it, and you don't know what to say in those situations because, like you said, there's so many, stigmas surrounding it that,
Right.
it's just not what they're expecting, and they're not sure how to respond.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so why don't let's back up a little bit and
Mhm.
set the context for us a little bit here. Before your husband died, tell us a little bit about your family and kind of what was going on.
Okay. So I married my husband when I was 20 years old. I was a baby.
Hmm.
And of course he was in the military. And we tried, having children about a year into our marriage. And I think that's the first time I noticed something was off.
Hmm.
I struggled to get pregnant. I've got polycystic ovarian syndrome, so
Hmm.
it wasn't happening, and we were going to need IVF, and we went through several years of infertility treatments, and so of course I was kind of starting to think of adoption, and he made it very, very clear to me that adoption was not an option.
Hmm.
And he just said some hurtful things at the time that kind of made me go, something's not right. I think something is being hidden. But of course, at 21, 22, 23 years old, you just think, well, it's stress. And I think
Hmm.
for many years, military life, he was gone a lot. Then we did end up having our kids, thankfully, with IVF. Um, but I think as time went on, those little things, that I saw became bigger, harder to hide. And of course, I kept attributing it to military lifestyles, those stresses, being away, things that I'd never understand because I was never there.
Hmm.
And, it went from kind of explosive stress behaviors to verbal, mental, emotional abuse. And then eventually that abuse began to boil over to my kids.
Hmm.
And then about 5 years before he died, he had started an affair. I found out about 2 years in,
Hmm.
when her husband actually contacted me because he found it.
Oh man.
Um, yeah, so that was a fun phone call to get at work.
Oh, at
Yeah,
work.
yeah,
Oh
and
boy.
yeah. So they both contended it was not physical. It was just emotional, and
Hmm.
kind of without proof. And I kind of just was like, okay, well, all I can do is forgive, and we're going to try to move forward. And things continued to snowball. The abuse was greater, and now we kind of swapped to, I was the one being accused of cheating. And that's when the time when you had to pay per gig of data on your cell phone plan. And if we would run out, well, obviously that meant I was doing something.
He was accusing you of running up your cell phone plan with some kind of affair,
a dating app or
communications.
something. Right.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and then, I eventually found out he came home unexpectedly one weekend. He was living in Tennessee. That's where he was stationed, but I was working in Virginia at the time. And I was working on my state licensure for teaching. So I had to stay put. And so he came home unexpectedly, and I was all excited. And, next thing I know, he's on his knees admitting he had had an affair, but with somebody else, and had an STD. And I likely had the STD.
Oh, no.
So, and of course I immediately thought it was the other woman, still contended it wasn't, and, keep going. And then I found out that they were, in fact, sleeping together the whole time. And that was about, I'd say maybe a year before his death. And so at this point, of course, I knew there were multiple affairs, and now it was getting so much worse. And I would say within the 2 months before he passed, he did finally go get help. He was referred to go get therapy. But he would often come home and say, something's wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. I don't know what it is. I just want somebody to tell me what's wrong. And he ended up actually going, of course, with the military, it's a little bit of a different system, but he ended up going to his, the medical person they had for their squadron, and asked for help again. And so they actually sent a referral out. But within, right before he died, he had become super paranoid. I remember him, I came into the room asking something, and he was like, shh, and pointed at the Alexa in the room. And he started, he texted, but didn't send it, I'm being recorded, and so that's when I went, okay, like now something's really wrong. And this is the week of Christmas, and everybody's closed. And so I went through his wallet to find his appointment card for his therapist. And so I looked up the therapist, and I realized, it wasn't even a doctor. It was not a psychiatrist. It was just kind of, I don't want to say run of the mill counseling, but I think, perhaps how he had phrased it, maybe they just thought it was like marriage counseling, type. But he needed real, analysis and help. And he had become, very watchful out the windows and waiting, and he was convinced he was going to be arrested. And he let me in the day before he died. He let me in on some things he had done prior to joining the military that he was just convinced were coming back to get him. And that he was finally going to jail for what he had done. And of course, I just thought, you're crazy. And I think I said, you're crazy. And I didn't realize, until after I was like, oh my gosh, he was losing control. And he had told me, I need you to hate me. And I kept trying so hard to be like, if I show him love and acceptance and get him help, he's going to realize it's all going to be okay. But at the same time, with all these revelations, one, I didn't even know if they were true, because I realized he was not thinking clearly. But two, I was like, I can't be married to him anymore. It's been too many years of abuse. And if these things are true, I'm done.
And this was the day before he died. At that point, obviously, you didn't know what was coming in just 24 hours or less.
Right. In fact, so it was Christmas Day when I got like the end, of all the information. And I was like, okay, first thing tomorrow when the office is open, I'm going to call his therapist. And of course, we didn't get to that point because it was, 5 something in the morning when I got up and went downstairs. And within maybe 20 minutes of me waking up, he had taken his own life in our room.
Man.
And so, yeah, so that's, it definitely went from, thinking maybe he was just a jerk, right? He was just stressed or a jerk or whatever, to, okay, he is a real problem, to he's gone. Like it escalated
So
very
quickly.
quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, you had two boys who were
Mhm.
young. How old were they at the time?
One was 8. I had just turned 8, and one was about to turn 10. I had one birthday just a few days before his dad died, and one birthday just about a month after his dad died. So really sandwiched around that time.
Right. Gosh, so you have a lot going on in like late December and early
Yes.
January.
Yes. Every year we now like go do something
Yeah.
that time of year just to go do. Yeah.
Sure. Um, so I was reading in your book, that so you initially you didn't tell the boys that he had died by suicide.
Hmm.
And then later you suspected that maybe your older boy had an idea that
Right.
something maybe wasn't quite adding up. And I think you ended up having a trauma therapist help you talk with them. Like, how can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah. We always think that we've done a really good job of protecting our kids from things, but they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
Yeah, for sure.
Every time there was an argument, it would go upstairs, or I'd try to get it upstairs, but I didn't think that they would ever think that their dad would have, hurt himself.
Mm.
I don't know how they did not hear what happened that day. I mean, it's just a miracle. It's the only thing I can think of. But I had called a friend of mine who was a therapist, and so it's the day after Christmas, and I'm like, I don't know what to tell them. And my dad was driving me there. My mom had taken the boys to her house, and so I had minutes. And so in that moment we decided it was just going to be, Daddy got hurt. I called 911. They tried to save him and they couldn't. To keep it to that point. But I want to say it was maybe the next day where my oldest, he was like, did Dad hurt himself? Like, did he do it to himself? And I was like, how has that even entered your mind?
Yeah.
And I was there were many times I was like, I don't know how to respond.
Right.
And it's just having them have that, I don't know if it was intuition or what you want to call it, or just he was putting things together, but it just, 10 years old, it was certainly, something I definitely was not prepared to deal with.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of things, but that was definitely one. Parenting through this type of loss, it's one thing to, handle it myself, but then I was trying so hard to protect them. And of course, immediately I was like, and I failed. They already know, and I thought I protected them this whole time, and I didn't.
I mean, it's so hard to know, right? What to say and what not to say, or how best to say things. And at least, for me, I know like the feeling like I have to get this right, but I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what right is. Like, I feel like if I say A or B, one of those is going to be wrong. One of those is going to be right, but I have no idea which one.
Right.
And feeling like the consequences might be dire,
Right. Yeah.
If I, back myself up to so my husband had brain cancer, in totally different discussions, but I think the same kind of feeling of like, how do I handle this? And how is this not going to completely destroy them? And how can I handle it maybe to help make that better somehow?
Right. Yeah. So I had contacted a therapist that was recommended, that dealt with trauma, and so I brought the boys, and, she took me into a room first, and she was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, oh, I think one of them already knows, and there's no way for one to know and not the other.
Yeah, for sure.
And I was like, I think we have to tell them, but I can't get this wrong. And she was like, okay, so we're gonna tell them together. And so we did. And I think I was expecting much more of a reaction out of them, but it was kind of like okay, that makes sense, and they definitely, kids, I think, just process. And I would say, like, you have that special hour, like when you're putting them to bed or when they first wake up, that they get really like chatty and cuddly, and we would have these moments. I'd be tucking them in and, snuggling with them, and, getting ready to, say our nighttime prayers and things. And I would get like a question or two, and it would happen kind of sporadically.
And you weren't expecting it necessarily.
Right. But I will say one thing that was great about therapy. I remember her going, now you can ask mommy any question you want, but sometimes she can't answer it right away because she needs to think about it, and she needs to
Ah,
make sure, that, she might need to call me so that, I can help her explain it, because she wants to make sure she does, the best she can. So they had
ah,
actually really learned, and had she not said that, I mean, thank God she said that, because, I got to the point of going, you're right. That's a really good question. Let me go talk to our friend so I can understand it better so we can talk about it.
I love that.
Um, yeah,
And
that was really helpful.
yeah, and because I know, for me, at least initially, I felt like, sort of a fear of questions that I couldn't answer, right? Like
Right,
a fear that I'd get some question and then be like a deer in the headlights, like, I don't know how to
right.
answer this, right? And
Hmm.
and therefore I went hoping and wanting desperately to avoid those questions.
Right.
And one of the major things I learned was, yeah, you don't have to be afraid of those questions necessarily.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not saying they're easy or anything, but like I love how you're suggesting, acknowledging that that's a really good question and that you do want to talk to them about it and you need a little time
Hmm.
to think about it or talk with your therapist and come back to them.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think that's really good practical advice. How did you have any difficulty then, like figuring out how to circle back? Like, you know.
Not so much. Like I said, they love their tuck in mommy time. So it
Hmm.
was, real good. I'd and there would be times where, he would be like, did you think about that question I asked you? But
Oh,
honestly, but most of the time, they waited. And I think, I don't know what it is about my kids, that they just like grew up or something like in that moment. And I think
hmm.
they understood. And but usually I'll be like, okay, remember that question you asked me about the other day,
Hmm.
are you ready to talk about it? Because I am, if you are. So I always had to ask them too, if they were in
Ah,
that mindset.
yeah.
And I think, one thing I loved about that is I also modeled for them that therapy is okay.
Hmm.
And sometimes we need to talk to somebody else, because they really struggled with therapy, talking to a stranger,
Mm.
so it was also really good to be like, mommy needs help too sometimes,
Hmm.
but yeah, I just learned to kind of ask them, I'm ready to answer this question when you're ready to talk about it.
Hmm.
And usually they're like, yeah, so, you know, and then
Yeah.
we talk about whichever one it was. And,
Yeah. I
but yeah.
love that.
Hmm.
And you're also, I think, modeling that, it's okay to have these difficult conversations. It's okay to talk about hard things.
Hmm.
It's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay for it to be an ongoing discussion. As you learn more, you can talk further about things.
Right.
And those are, I mean, when you're talking about kids, there could be all kinds of hard topics in the future for any children, including our children who have lost.
Hmm.
Other things that come up as teenagers, and modeling that we can talk about hard things, I think carries over to other hard things.
Right. Absolutely. And you build also that, mom is someone you can talk to even when it's something that's awful.
Yeah.
I think it's whether they acknowledge it or not. I really hope that, when my kids are 18 and away at college and something hard happens, they go, you know what, I can talk to her.
Yeah.
She might be mad at me, but I can talk to her,
Right.
you know, so,
Yeah, because of how you've modeled and handled these discussions, for
mhm,
years by that point. Well, it'll
right.
be 10 years at that point. If they were 8 and 10, I think you said.
Hmm. Right.
And how old are they now?
So I've got 12 and 14 now.
Aha. Okay.
So yeah.
Busy ages. One starting high school,
Yes.
maybe?
Yes, yes, and we have driver's ed this week. I don't know.
Oh,
So
wow.
in North Carolina, you start driver's ed 14 and a half.
Oh, really?
So
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
but yeah, so we're getting to all these, discussions, and even things on, what's appropriate to watch on TV and what's going
Uh,
on social media. So I'd like to think that because of what we've been through, though, we're able to talk about a lot,
mhm.
of things. So that's one thing I'm really grateful for, that, had we not been through this, I might not have that type of relationship with them.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Something you just said made me think of another part of your story. You mentioned you're going to start driving lessons soon. That can be, that's sort of a milestone in a kid's life,
Mhm.
an exciting thing, like graduations and weddings and proms and um, I don't know, big sports events or whatever kind of, exciting kid milestone kind of things. Learning to drive is one
Mhm.
of those. And I know sometimes people are, that can be hard because you're like, oh, their dad, their mom, my spouse should have been here for that.
Right.
And it's difficult that they're not. And I noticed in your book, you talked about how you had made a widow friend shortly after your loss and how different her experience was from yours. I think it was not a suicide loss.
Yeah, it was an
Um,
accident.
okay. And she would think of her husband on special occasions, wishing he was there to share in a moment or a life event that he should have been there for. I would encounter those same moments, glad that he wasn't there to ruin them. I wonder if you could talk about that a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, I think the first time I had that, so last year, um, the stars aligned so that my boys could play football together, middle school, one was the
Mm,
youngest, one was the oldest. And
yeah.
so they were on the middle school team. And so, they're all in their pads in their uniform and they come, walk it out onto the field. And it's tough because I was like, oh, their dad would have loved to have seen this.
Mm,
But then almost before I finished that thought, yeah, I had a flashback to when, they were playing baseball and one of them screwed up on the field. And so he's screaming, yelling, cussing in front of everybody there and goes to his car and speeds off. And my kids
mm,
are broken. And I was like, I'm glad he's not there to ruin and pick apart, what, because they're going to make mistakes and it's
yeah,
just a game, and
sure.
it's,
And they're in middle
and
school
it,
and they're playing football, so they're gonna drop
right.
the ball or something.
Right. And so I had that thought. And like I said, my friend, she'll post, these tributes when, her daughter makes the high school volleyball team for the first time. And you'd be so proud of her and all these things. And it's just like, I can't imagine because, I would have loved it for him to have gotten proper help, medication and whatnot, and become a healthy part of their lives, whether or not we were married.
Hmm.
But I think over the course of the years, and even when he was kind of getting help, he'd make so many comments that I'm not going on medication. There's nothing wrong with me. But then, of course, we had there's something wrong with me. And I don't think he was ever going to be a healthy individual for them. I
Mm,
just, after seeing it so many times and trying to encourage him to get help over the years, I just don't think he was sick. And I think, that the boys just never would have had that. And it was really sad in that moment, not because of the initial thought of, I wish he was here, but I wish they could have had that, but they weren't going to. And being
right.
grateful, for the people that are in our lives now that were there to encourage them, even when they did drop the ball or, do whatever it was, have a penalty thrown that day.
Right.
Being grateful for the ones that chose to be there, even coming into their lives later.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for telling us about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is even just acknowledging that, right? I hope helps some people feel a little bit less alone in what they're experiencing with their losses and their situations, because
Right.
I think it's hard to talk about this stuff and to be, open and public about it so that other people can learn from, from your sharing. So again, thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Well, yeah,
Um,
I think you're right too, because the first time, my therapist friend was like, you feel relieved, don't you? And I was like, I'm not allowed to say that. Like, nobody else can know. And so I think just feeling seen in that moment, that's how I felt, even though I didn't tell anybody else, just having one person understand and identify with those feelings and letting me know it was okay to feel that way, I think is really important.
yeah. Well, and so I noticed along those lines, you've titled your book The Relieved Widow.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think it's, and I talk about, watching my grandmother die when I was 19 when she passed away, and she'd been fighting cancer for, I think, 8 years. And, when she finally died, as much as we were heartbroken, I feel like my grandfather, who had quit his job and become a full-time caretaker, was just so glad she wasn't in pain anymore. And that's one thing that I realized, that my husband had been in pain. And I don't think that was something I really started to understand until I kind of started, undoing the rat's nest of what had been going on, and understanding that he was truly sick and in pain. And was just, kind of losing grip with what was reality.
Well, that reminds me, I noticed after your husband died, well, I think one of the first people you called was his brother. And I think you got the sense from him and maybe other of his family members that they didn't seem entirely surprised that he had died by suicide. And yet it was a shock to you.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So I had mentioned, things that had happened before he had joined the military, that had kind of been mentioned early on, and then came back up, right before he died. And so when I told his brother, and I was like, okay, I'm starting to put pieces, together. And I was kind of like, okay, you need to help me understand. And, at some point before he had joined, maybe a few years before he joined the military, they had made him go get help. And my understanding is, he was put on medication. So there was something that had happened, and I guess had talked about suicide at that time, but that was never told to me. And I can only imagine if he was a minor when it happened, it wasn't in his records when he joined the military. So, I would think that would have come up, but yeah, I had no clue. And then, I found out that he had called another family member from the ship, maybe a year and a half before he died, maybe about a year before he died, and also was talking about suicide. But again, nothing was said. And maybe that's because we want to believe, no, that's not going to happen. I can certainly understand the reaction of, okay, we're not going to talk about that, so it doesn't happen. But yeah, not having any clue, and I often wonder, had I known about those things, would I have approached things differently? But yeah, so it was a very shocking, on top of the other shock, I know that my father-in-law's stepdaughter, had made a post on Facebook in the days after he died. And she was like, everybody sat around the table talking about how they weren't surprised, and that, they're surprised he made it this long. And they, they thought that he was doing better. He got married, had kids, and life was good, but they weren't surprised. And then I saw that post, and and these conversations are being had, and I'm over here going, hello,
yeah, you're like, I was his wife for 15 years, and I'm like,
yeah,
I didn't know this.
Right. Absolutely. So it was definitely, and that's part of, suicide loss in general is so complicated. And, some people, of course, think you absolutely should have known. But of course, I saw the symptoms of a mental illness that was never diagnosed, so I didn't know they were symptoms of something. Like I said, I thought, he was just stressed or he was being a jerk. But I didn't realize that they were symptoms.
Yeah. Well, and so speaking of suicide loss being complicated, sometimes people say suicide is selfish, and I gather people said that to you in the wake of this loss. How did you feel about that, or how did you react to that?
I mean, it definitely feels like a slap in the face, because, and of course you grow when you're understanding, I thought the exact same thing when it happened. I was like, I can't believe he did this to us. I just, how could you do that to your children? I had those thoughts, but, and I kind of describe this in the book as you'll be, doing something mundane, and all of a sudden, a thought or a conversation or something pops into your head, and you rewatch that or you replay that in your mind, and you go, oh my gosh, that was actually this, or he was actually meaning this. So as you put it together and you get a broader understanding, then you realize he was sick. And, I told my boys the same thing. I was like, when Mima had cancer, we couldn't see it, but we could see her hair falling out.
Mm-hmm.
I said, so, daddy's brain was getting eaten away by a cancer of types, and we couldn't see it. We only saw the symptom, which was that he was angry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as we kind of put those together, and then, and like I would have those moments and the kids would have those moments where they'd be like, wait a minute, when he did this, was this because of this? And so I found that even they were replaying, little moments, little interactions, because there was one point he got mad at them for fighting and took a Nerf gun and made him look at it, and he cracked it over his knee and threw it over his shoulder. And, they were so
devastated, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes. And that was one of those moments where it was actually my younger, he's like, when daddy broke the Nerf gun, was that because he was sick? And I was like, yeah, all of that is all a symptom of an illness. Yeah.
Right. Well, and what I love about the larger point that I think waves through some of our discussion here is that you modeled for them having these discussions openly to where, whatever your son is thinking about, he can pop up with a question. Was that Nerf gun thing because of his illness? Right. And I think the, an important point here is by sending a signal that the door is open. He felt comfortable to come forward with that question in that moment. It was probably some random time when you weren't even, who knows what was going on. Maybe you're rushing off to soccer practice or I don't know what, right? And I think that's an important thing for widowed parents to try to strive for, sending that message that the door is open to these conversations so that when they do pop up, your kids know they can ask.
And that's also one of those things is, everybody in my circle was like, you've got to take him to therapy. And so we did therapy. But the boys didn't want to talk. Like they were refusing. And so finally I was relieved when the therapist was like, I don't think you need to come see me anymore. She's like, they're not talking. It's making them clam up. The most important thing is that they know they can talk to you and you're going to be as honest as you can whenever they have a question. And as long as they have that, they're going to be okay. And so that's when we stopped going to therapy, because I felt like I had permission to do it that way. But yet I'd have people at their school, well, is he in therapy? And I'd be like,
right. Well, yeah. And that's the tricky thing. Yeah. That's the tricky thing because like if kids won't talk in therapy, like the interesting thing about like, if your kid has a broken arm and the doctor puts a cast on it, then the arm is going to heal. The kid doesn't have to participate in helping it heal. As long as it's casted, right? Then you let 6 weeks go by or whatever amount of time. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. But, you put the cast on. The treatment is the cast. And then the arm heals, whether or not the kid is actively participating in the healing process.
Right.
Therapy, though, is not like that. The act of sending them to therapy and walking through the door and sitting on the couch doesn't necessarily help if the kid or any person, actually the adult, but doesn't engage in the process or isn't willing to engage in the process and the discussions.
And that's what's, and of course, so I have 2 boys, totally different personalities. My older one went into, I'm the man of the house, and he sat down with me like the week after his dad died, and he wanted to go through the budget with me. He wanted to make sure we were going to be okay. But then on the other side, I'm going to put on my face and I'm fine. I'm over it. He would say that. And he would even say, I'm glad he's gone, and make those I'm fine. But then, my other one, of course, he'll still have moments where I walk in his room, put him in bed and he'll start crying, so they're very different. And they do it on their own timeline. It was only recently that my oldest, had gotten upset over something. And of course, I'm the kind, I want to push you to talk until you get it out and say what you need to say. And so we're kind of talking and he was telling me how he was feeling. I said, well, why do you think you feel that way? And he goes, because I've been through trauma, Mom. I had a reaction. And I was like, yes, you said it. You did. So like, and that was almost, that was about 4 years later that he was finally able to make some mention of there's been damage here and I recognize it. And maybe because I talk it to death, I don't know. But you know, it's, whereas the other one, you know, he'll talk about it all the time, you know, and he's, you know, so they're very different and you have to handle them so differently.
Yeah.
And of course, they're both so different from even me, who, again, I want to push you until you just say what I know you need to say.
Right.
So yeah, so it's, I've had to learn to kind of back off, and I don't always back off, but I try. You know, but I just want them, yeah, you know, but you know, you just want them to know that you're here.
Right.
And, you know, we can work on it together.
Sure, sure. Well, and I think this is an important point too, right? Multiple kids in the family means multiple grief experiences, potentially, if not likely, right? I mean, someone might think, okay, there's two boys, they're both boys, they're 8 and 10, which is close in age. It's not, you know, but it's and they both lost the same person, which is their father. So you might jump to a conclusion that they have a similar experience, and there certainly are similarities in, you know, what they're experiencing. But like you're saying, I think for parents to be aware and prepared that the reactions and the way they process and what they need might be quite different, based on all kinds of things. And like you said, I mean, all three of you lost the same person. You lost a spouse and they lost a parent, which then also makes that an entirely different loss, even though it's the same individual.
Well, yeah, and I also say that even though they both lost a dad, they both lost a different person because they had different relationships. And whereas my older one saw much more of the abuse, and I think that's just because he was older, so he was picking up on one. I mean, he's the first one that kind of had an inclination of what had happened. Whereas, you know, my younger son, you know, saw a much more loving dad than my older son did. So then there's also some resentment there, you know, so it's definitely, you know, different between the two.
Sure. Yeah. Gosh, this is a really important discussion. So thank you for sharing all this with us. I hope that people will come away from this feeling a little bit less alone. And I think that in your book, you are open and honest and share, like, look, this is what it was like for us, which is not the same as for everybody, but I think there are certainly people could see themselves in different aspects of your story and hopefully feel less alone that way too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was my whole goal, because I know I felt so alone.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I think you mentioned, you know, your husband was in the military. There's an organization called TAPS, which is for supporting military families with death losses. I think you were involved with TAPS at one point.
I did. I worked for them about a year. It was about a year actually after he passed, that I was really kind of looking for how to make meaning, you know, out of what had happened. So yeah, I went to work with them, and I worked in survivor care, which basically means I was assigned all suicide loss spouses. So I, you know, hundreds and hundreds in just my little database that I would reach out and talk to. And so many of them, especially because diagnosing mental illness in the military is very uncommon, that so many of them were really struggling with, there was no diagnosis. But then we would talk, and then they would go, oh, wait a minute, there was also abuse. Oh, wait a minute, he was also cheating, or there was alcohol abuse or substance abuse, or, you know, all these different aspects that pointed to something was wrong. And, you know, many of them were wanting to get a divorce, or, you know, had already separated. And so there was a lot of anger and a lot of confusion. And, you know, I would kind of go, you know, this is what I experienced. And I'd finish telling my story, and they'd be like, oh my gosh, it's not just me. And so that was kind of like a light bulb for me, you know, that I was like, okay, there are people out there like me. You know, it still took me a few years to, you know, I thought about writing a book for some time. And then finally I was like, okay, I turned 40, and I was like, it's time. And so then I went ahead and went for it. So just to reach others, that have that feeling, because I know what it feels like.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm going to put a link to TAPS in the show notes, because I think for anybody who's listening who is a military family, TAPS has all kinds of programs and resources that I think are worth checking out.
Absolutely.
Could be helpful for, for spouses and children, families who've lost somebody who was in the military.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I'll put that link in the show notes for sure. Okay, gosh, I think we could keep talking about this all day long. We are going to have to wrap up here. So, I always like to ask my guests at the end for a piece of a parting advice. And so if you could say one thing to a widowed parent with a loss to suicide, what would you say to them?
I always have two things, and that's one, you're going to get it wrong. You're going to say the wrong thing. And that's okay, because you can work on fixing that. There are many times I, made comments, especially in the early days, to the kids. I remember saying, well, your dad left us. And looking back as I grew in my understanding, I was like, and that was damaging, because then, I overheard my son tell my other one, he's like, well, dad left us. And I was like, okay, wait, we need to have a talk. I was wrong, and so we would have those conversations, as I learned things, I would share with them and be like, I thought this, I think we all thought this. And here's how I know that that's not the case. So I would, that's always my big takeaway is you're going to do it wrong. But it's also the others, it's okay to have all the feelings. There is no proper way, to, look back at a death and be like, I should act this way. Like my friend who's always doing all these, tributes to her late spouse. It's okay not to feel that way, because it had become so ugly and so messy. And that was your reality, and it's okay to talk about it. It's okay, to have those feelings.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And the first point about, it's never too late to go back and discuss things. As you said,
Right.
if you have new information, or if you've just realized that it would be helpful to clarify something or rediscuss it with a new understanding. I think that's a really important point. So thank you for helping, for closing with that. Okay, so I think that's a great place to end. My guest today is Amanda-Lee Pitzer, who is the author of a new book, The Relieved Widow. So Amanda-Lee, where can listeners find you if they'd like to learn more about your work?
You can visit my website, which is www.therelievedwidow.com. And that's got a link to the book, as well as different pieces I write for another organization and a list of speaking engagements.
Terrific. All right. Well, Amanda-Lee, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Amanda-Lee Pitzer as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 156. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.